right, everyone, I think we'll begin. Really excited for today. I think we're loosely calling this space Planetary Living Room for this day, so really excited to gather all of you, speakers, respondents, students. Yeah, it's a real pleasure for us. So this is the Planetary Media, Climate Crisis, and the Technological Imagination. And it's a really rare treat, I would say, to gather all of you, like brilliant thinkers in the room for a whole day, and I'm looking forward to discussing what it might mean to represent, mediate, and think the planetary today. So a few quick things before we start. Please note we will have 2 sessions. This morning, media infrastructures with talks by Alenda, Chang, Tega, Daniel Jacobs, and Gökçe, Günel, and followed by lunch in the room next door. Then in the afternoon, we will have Planetary Sensibilities. We'll hear from Macarena Gomez-Barres, Ainsley Allen Robson, and Anne-Sophie Ronskog and John Palmesino, who will join us on Zoom. Each session will have responses by invited faculty and a Q&A led by our cohort of students, and open it up to the audience as well, with the opportunity to have a symposium-wide conversation at the end. So please stick around for that conversation. Really want to hear, what folks have gleaned throughout the day and kind of wrapping it up together. I want to thank the dean, the GSAPP staff, a fabulous group of students for making this possible, from invites to posters, AV, down to the cluster of household lamps on the table by students. So it really is a living room. Please note on the stair landing, it's kind of the 100, 200 level, you might have seen it already, is our student group Toxos. I don't know if any Toxos folks are here, but Sam's one of the co-founders at the back. The exhibition that is on is a pop-up, kind of parallel to the symposium, called Distributed Grounds, Infrastructure, Testimony, and Planetary Media. So definitely check that out. They will have a lunch hour in between sessions where folks will be up there and to talk about their project with you on Newtown Creek. It's the kind of research they're doing. So exciting times. Okay, so to open, let me preface with some initial ways the planetary has been on my mind. Even as Artemis II makes its way back to Earth, breaking records and spreading moon joy, this is not the planetary that I mean to invoke. Nor do I mean legacy building projects like the Golden Record or the hubris of forever. For me, the planetary is a non-innocent term, implying a certain massiveness of techno-social relations, and with it, the impossibility of a single vantage. I'll briefly speak for a few minutes on my own situated perspective and why I'm so excited to have everyone here today, and then introduce our wonderful guests for the morning. So first, how do planetary representations not just show, but operate on the world? From deep ocean sensors to lunar resource maps, images and data sheets have long mediated science and resource exploration. They rehearse the extractive gaze of empire, one that seeks to quantify, exploit, and govern by making visible. Image-making devices have also been diffused into the contemporary environment as deeply networked ensembles. Today, even your smart doorbell turns the front door into thresholds of surveillance and search. Even at home, you are a data point in this mesh. Yet, however encompassing planetary scale computing may seem, models and data sets obscure how they operate and who they train on. These accidental megastructures are quite deliberate in hiding workers from its visual frame. The planetary also marks the difference between the weather and the climate. If blue marbles and blue skies signify optimism, the visual sirens of climate science paint the globe in chromatics of emergency, what Birgit Schneider has called the burning worlds of cartography. Yet it seems that we notice the Earth is burning only when the sky itself burns bright red, not least from fossil-fueled fascism, war, and genocide. This we is not a global we, but a limited, privileged we, implicated in this horrific entanglement at a distance, in which dusts and bombs enact planetary violence on those forced to live the end of the world on a daily basis. The environment itself indeed mediates vision by getting in the way. Meneaga writes that dust is an inconvenience to the architectural regimes of vision and solidity. By hiding and clouding vision, dust, and if I might add here, debris, marks the destruction of stability. The second way I'm thinking about planetary media is through small, deliberate acts of design, reframing relations to physical matter through representation and making. As friends making work, which is a design collective with Christine Giorgio and Gabriel Vergara, who are here as well, we've been interested in making sensible the sprawling registers of waste, salvage, and geological extraction. This might be understood as broken wall design, which was by Stephen Jackson and then taken by Kilmo into architecture, where exhibitions have become a way for us to explore working at the finite margins of growth by attuning ourselves to the leakiest parts of the system. Construction dust, for example, lets us navigate massive material flows through the smallest scale of encounter. Instead of sensing, or common sense, all of the things that should be challenged, sensibility is to be vulnerable to external factors. Sensibilities suggests a group's capacity to respond to complex stimuli. Rather than from above, the planetary socializes a common ethic of vulnerability on the ground. So there appears to be a more than human temporality at stake, and I guess this is opening a question to guests as well. How might geological time, solar time, plant time, or infrastructural time reposition architecture in contrast to the linear time of progress to which both construction and informatics currently subscribe? Nicole Starosielski posits that the most influential messages of the 21st century will not be sent through words and images, but through heat and cold. Through planetary exposure, can we, for example, draw with the sun, and what relations might we draw together through representation? So as we go about today, do carry some notes with you. Please think with us. This is kind of a loose smattering of thoughts, and let's see if we can get closer to a better question at the end of what is planetary media, or perhaps what it does. With that, I'm so excited to hear from our amazing array of speakers today. It's really a treat, whose brilliant bodies of work far exceed what is on this slide. In this room, we span many disciplines: art, architecture, anthropology, computation, media studies, science, engineering, environmental humanities. So our first four speakers, and I'll introduce them all now and have them present in sequence, is Alenda Y. Chang, Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has written extensively about the environmental impacts of digital games, including the 2019 book, Playing Nature, Ecology in Video Games, an exciting book. She was an early member of the IGDA Climate Special Interest Group and currently serves on the advisory board of Strategies, Sustainable Transition for Europe's Game Industries. At UCSB, Chang co-directs Wireframe, a studio promoting collaborative theoretical and creative media practice with investments in global and social and environmental justice. She's also a founding co-editor of the UC Press open access journal, Media and Environment. And there's a podcast as well. Tega Brain is an Australian artist and environmental engineer, born when atmospheric CO2 levels were below 350 parts per million. Her work examines ecology, data, automation, and infrastructure. She's an industry associate professor of integrated design and media at New York University, and her first book, Code as Creative Medium, was published by MIT Press. Her work has been exhibited at the Smithsonian, the Whitney Museum, ZKM Karlsruhe, Haus der Kulturen der Welt, the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, and the Haus der elektronischen Künste. She has received awards, fellowships, and residencies from Ars Electronica, IBEAM, Pioneer Works, Data and Society, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and won a Creative Capital Award for body of work developing alternative carbon offsetting methodologies. Daniel Jacobs is an instructional assistant professor at the Gerald D. Hines College of Architecture and Design at University of Houston. He is a co-founder of research and design collaborative Home Office, which explores the reciprocity between architectural types, the technical assemblies, and the environment. He is the editor of recent edited volume Architecture as Environmental Media, Rendering the Planetary. We may even have a few book contributors in this room today, Debbie, Chen, and perhaps maybe Galen Patti as well. Daniel holds a Master of Architecture from Yale University School of Architecture and a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from WashU in St. Louis. And Daniel is a registered architect in Texas and New York. And Gökçe Günel is an associate professor in anthropology at Rice University. Her research investigates how infrastructure transforms amid energy and climate change related challenges. Her most recent book, Floating Power, Energy, Infrastructure, and South-South Relations, which just came out, Duke University Press, examines the emergence of a Turkish-built floating power plant in Ghana, analyzing how such inventive infrastructure shapes South-South relations and embodies broader imaginations of energy futures. Her first book, Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, 2019, focused on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the UAE, with a specific emphasis on the Masdar City project. Dr. Günel is one of the editors of LIM and has most recently co-edited LIM 11, The Obsolescence Issue. She's also co-authored a manifesto for patchwork ethnography and co-leads patchwork ethnography. The book, Patchwork Ethnography, a methodological guide, is forthcoming with the U Chicago Press in 2027. So, incredible group, and I'll introduce our respondents towards the end. So please let's welcome Alenda, Chang. Thank you.
So today, I think I'm gonna kind of weave a story of sometimes self-proclaimed eco-mothers and fathers, and also a story about scale, and some of the ways that I've been forced to revisit some of my earlier propositions about digital games in light of the rapid advance of a certain strain of Silicon Valley planetarity. I think Emmeline was gesturing toward this too. So planetarity in that sense, I think, is not utopian, but rather a reflection of the outsized fortunes and resultant ambitions of millionaires, billionaires, now a trillionaire, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, right? And with their rocket launches and space trips, and their increasing commerce in politics and world affairs. As for my earlier propositions about digital games, I'm thinking about my longstanding interest in scale and also experimentation and the ways that games have and still can enable transscalar modes of thinking and quasi-scientific experiences of world alteration. At the time, when I was writing Playing Nature, games like Spore, Katamari Damacy, and even David O'Reilly's Everything already offered ostensibly similar but philosophically very different ways of modeling matter, from the very minute to the interstellar. And although I did quibble with Spore's terrestrially biased version of evolution and very simplistic ecosystem niches, or Everything's comical lack of behavioral variety, if you've played that game, everything behaves the same. I was ultimately hopeful about games' ability to dramatize transscalar connection. Perhaps, I thought, they could help liberate us from our human perceptual, spatial, and temporal biases by suggesting life worlds and embodied experiences well beyond our own Umwelt, right? So when Emmeline reached out last year with this theme of planetary media in mind, I took the opportunity to reflect on my own thinking. So even after criticizing Spore for encouraging players to think that climate change and biodiversity loss could be solved with surgical precision by advanced technologies and replacement fauna and flora stolen from other planets, was I still leaving room for other so-called God games, where the player is like an omniscient and omnipotent deity hovering over a map or a world, to do it better? Or was the whole genre suspect? To wrestle with this problem, I found myself returning to two non-game visions of our planet. And I think one is fairly well known and the other maybe not so much. Let's see. So the first is the Whole Earth catalog, which was published by American countercultural icon Stuart Brand and had its heyday in the late 60s and early 70s. And the catalog, given its name and cover layouts, right, this is just a sample, helped popularize some of the first color images of the whole Earth from space. And much, of course, has been made of the 1972 Apollo 17 image known as the Blue Marble, and the impact that generally seeing Earth from an external perspective had on a rising generation of counterculture enthusiasts and environmentalists. So as the common refrain goes, this image, or images like this, simultaneously highlighted the beauty and the fragility of our planet and our place on it, drawing new or renewed attention to its limitations and our need to prioritize better use of existing space and resources. So sometimes this is called the spaceship Earth mentality, right? What I find curious is how, when you look at this, when they're placed side by side, the successive issues of the whole Earth catalog mimic a common action in games like Spore, which is scrolling or zooming in or out from one scale to another. And so you can see we're kind of like, I don't know, zooming or dollying back until we reach an outside perspective, on the Earth, and then to our own galaxy with our own planet kind of cartoonishly question marked in the Milky Way. And then later, I think this is, I can't even read that, but we return back to Earth, and this time it's seen mostly in shadow. While I have kind of mixed feelings about Brand's particular brand of environmentalism, I've seen him in person, talk, and I regularly show one of his cringier TED Talks to my students. It's the one that says, why squatter cities can save the world. I don't know if anyone's seen that one. Yeah, okay. But, I think that a lot of people would see a resemblance between that kind of whole Earth rhetoric and God game mechanics. And Brand is, after all, the one who's credited as often saying something like, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it, right? The other planetary prognosticator that came to my mind immediately while I was preparing the talk was the renowned entomologist E.O. Wilson. So this is the kind of less well-known thing, I think. 10 years ago, he published a grand call to action with the book Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. Put simply, Wilson argues that we ought to set aside half of the world's landmass and seas as the exclusive domain of other species. And when Half Earth came out, I remember admiring the spirit of this imperative, right? That our planet is shared and that humans are not entitled to all of it. But I also instinctively and immediately regretted how tone deaf the proposition was likely to sound, especially to people that are barely eking out a living or subsistence farming or displaced from their homelands by war, famine, or extreme weather. So Wilson's thought experiment / call to action was arguably committing the same grievous errors that generations of mostly white, well-meaning, affluent Western environmental activists had committed in the name of Mother Earth, namely shutting out or ignoring the needs of the poor, people of color, and developing nations, as if social injustice and environmental injustice were not interlinked. And I should say, I just reread it on the plane, that Wilson is quick to defend conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy. He's been on the board of a lot of them, or was on the board of a lot of them. He passed away like 5 years ago. So he's quick to defend them from these now very common criticisms. But you can tell that his heart really isn't in it, because later on in the book, he actually complains that the Nature Conservancy has turned too much toward human welfare and like economic considerations, rather than what he thinks is its core mission of preserving biodiversity. And the book gave rise to something called the Half Earth Project, which I believe is still administered by his Biodiversity Foundation. And this project, from what I can tell, seems pretty haphazardly aimed at actually realizing the Half Earth goal. Maybe it lacks the funding or the political clout to buy up large parcels of land and then segregate them off for non-human nature. So, instead, it supports things like Half Earth Day with events held annually. It supports scientists through chairships and funding, like grants. And then it maintains this kind of online presence complete with this interactive world map, which is kind of becoming cliched, and also a species protection index. And they say that these are tools for both the public and also decision-making bodies like the UN. And I just put a few of these slides so you can see. So you can kind of open up the panels for biodiversity and then overlay these filters on top of the world map. So this, I think I had selected species richness, and because all my relatives live in Taiwan, I was like, oh, look, Taiwan is species rich, because it's kind of more intensely yellow, right, up there in the top right. And there's a lot about, it's actually in line with a lot of what he talks about with island biogeography and the sort of uniqueness of species that evolve or have adaptive radiation into environments like Madagascar or Taiwan or other places. And then this one I just pulled because, hey, we're here. There's another panel where you can click on a filter for protected areas, so you can kind of see what is currently protected. And I don't know enough about this area to know what part of Manhattan is in the green there. I tried to figure this out and failed, so maybe we can figure that out later collectively. So, this is kind of just two of the filters, richness and protection. So before I get to the question of whether or not half-Earth thinking is any better than whole-Earth thinking, we might ask, what would Wilson's proposal look like as a game? And it turns out that's really not hard to imagine, because the proposal itself, I think, is already very game-like. But I would argue it's not very playful. And I think that's an important difference. And it's one that I'm coming to realize is at the heart of my discomfort with certain games and certain ideas. And if trying to imagine half-Earth as a game seems far-fetched, let me just point out that Wilson himself often refers to everything from evolution to the half-Earth gambit, or what he calls a gamble, as a game. And I think we have a number of options for half-Earth the game. We could go back to good old Sim Earth, the God game. This is the version that was released for the Commodore Amiga in 1992. And so brilliantly written about by Mackenzie Wark in the essay Third Nature. Sim Earth allowed you to view your nascent Earth as a spinning globe in space or as a flat projection, and it encouraged you to play through both preset scenarios and free-form experiments in ecological and technological development. And if you've played this game, via emulation or whatever, or back in the day, it can present as a very overwhelming clutter of separate windows tracking various aspects of your developing biosphere. My favorite has and always will be the Gaia window, which is this vaguely feminized anthropomorphic representation of the Earth with bright red lipstick and eyeshadow. And so, not happy at this point, but at any rate, this pseudoscientific simulation game has a lot in common with the half-Earth map and its various filters and indices. And it's really not hard for me to imagine either a coded or self-enforced goal to successfully keep one's human population supported on half of the biosphere's land and sea. Option 2 might be something like the much-touted quote-unquote, reverse city builder game, Terra Nil, which superficially upends genre expectations, of games like SimCity, or even the adjacent genre of 4X games like Civilization. So rather than extracting resources and building up a functional city or civ through infrastructure, services, and supply chains, players of Terra Nil are tasked with restoring polluted biomes by deploying technology to restore optimum levels of atmosphere and other things for other life forms, and then removing all traces of that technology before blasting off to another planet, presumably to do the same thing again. Players, the developers of Terra Nil and players of it have really embraced the game as evidence of a progressive degrowth mentality. It does feel a little half-earthy in the way that you render planets habitable for other species, not your own, and then remove all traces of your interventions. But, okay, not to entirely rain on the parade, right? But I see Terra Nil less as a reverse city builder than as a city builder that picks up where we usually leave off. So it's one where we're forced to deal with the consequences of rampant growth and development. But Terra Nil spares us the grisly interval, right? Traces, when you start, traces of former habitation and tech are mostly gone. Even the ruined landscapes have a kind of austere beauty. The animal and plant species that we're helping to flourish are still around. They're just waiting for better conditions. So there's no mention of extinction, right? And ultimately, I think Terra Nil is still recognizably a God game, or better yet, what game scholar Laura Optebeke calls Gaia games, by which she means ecological God games, with their classic emphases on managerial logics and technological solutions. And I don't have time to do her work justice here, but she has a really great article called Anthropocene, Temporality, and Gaia Games, where she actually notes that there's been a recent trend in Gaia games away from map interfaces and toward whole Earth imagery, and also the kind of contradictory impulses that are implied by that new planetary impulse. And then as a final option, I'm thinking actually of an analog game, and this might be a little controversial, but I've long thought that Wilson's Half-Earth project is uncomfortably close to Brenda Romero's now notorious art game. Some of you might know this, called Train, which she debuted in 2009. In this minimalist game, players were basically just asked to efficiently load train cars with stylized little yellow figures, and the winner presumably was the one that got the most figures to the track terminus. So at first, the game proceeds innocently enough, perhaps evoking fond memories of Ticket to Ride. But at some point, it's revealed that these trains are actually simulating transport to Holocaust concentration camps, and the players become complicit in having basically packed them with victims of Nazi persecution. So, maybe a Half-Earth game that was worth its salt would similarly foreground issues of complicity with more complexity. So, we're complicit in the destruction and degradation of other species' habitats, whether or not, we're just going about our everyday lives. And if we did enact what would essentially be a gigantic planetary reserve, right, for the survival of other species, we would also face responsibility for the suffering and displacement of many people. At this point, I want to present an alternative, just no slide here, but just to think about this. So let's call it a partial Earth mentality. As a badge-carrying feminist STS scholar, I can't help but return to Donna Haraway's celebration of situated knowledges and the privilege of partial perspective. I'll always be grateful to Haraway for how she has consistently imagined planetary cohabitation with other species as something that's embodied, place-based, and often technically mediated, whether it's by pharmaceutical labs or cameras or computers or taxidermied, specimens, right? And while she's very rarely ventured an opinion on video games, her work and approach to other species is eminently playful. And, I'm thinking of her documentation of canine agility and naming her barn cats after Buffy the Vampire Slayer characters, publishing her emails, and writing speculative fiction about symbiogenetic children, right? And before someone objects by asking, well, isn't Wilson's Half-Earth also, isn't that basically a partial Earth mentality? Let me argue that I think there's still a whole Earth implied in that half. Wilson, as a very good naturalist, arrives at the half estimate by applying a rough law of the relationship between habitat destruction and species reduction, which is called the fourth root rule. And so he uses that to calculate that if only 10% of ecosystems are preserved, only a little over half of the world's species will survive. Whereas if we manage to preserve 50% of ecosystems, about 84% of species can survive, right? And that's kind of why he picks half and not a third or a quarter. And I think I just want to point out, since I wrote about this in the introduction to Playing Nature, that he's also participating in this debate that scientists have called SLOSS, S-L-O-S-S, or stands for single large or several small. And this is in regard to the size and the connectivity of nature reserves. So, we can imagine that maybe having a string of smaller but connected, protected lands might help like migrating animals or animals that just naturally have larger territories. But I think, at least in Wilson's eyes, science has definitively come down on the large side, right? So having a larger uninterrupted reserve is better because it minimizes edge effects and it minimizes impact to especially sensitive species. And he's really adamant that we can't solve the sixth extinction event that's happening now through piecemeal action, right, or piecemeal reserves. So, a partial Earth approach, as I'm looking at it, would be humble about what we know and don't know. It would recognize other species as kin of a kind. It would offer learning and care as a palliative to ignorance and harm. And, Wilson could fit the bill here, but he's noticeably less accepting of the inevitable hybridization and cross-species encounters that occur at wild and human land interfaces. Let alone talking about that other half of Earth that we would presumably live on, where we would still be alongside, a few minutes, okay, a lot of domesticated and wild animals, right? And lots of other kinds of species. And so he directs a lot of scorn toward novel ecologies in his book. So he kind of finds it to be an offensive term, and he associates it with people like Earl Ellis, Eileen Christ, Peter Kareva, and Emma Maris. And this list includes, scientists, conservationists, and Emma Maris is a science journalist who I've actually talked to a lot and was kind of really inspired by her work on Rambunctious Garden. And so he's not tolerant of this idea of quote-unquote invasive species and novel ecologies, and de-extinction science gets lumped in with that. Okay, so let me just kind of speed up and just show you a few nice games. So all of this is just to say that I've really had to temper my hopes for games in regard to scale and to mesocosmic experimentation. So in this era of increasingly masculinist and technocratic big thinking and plans for space tourism, I just find myself tapping the brakes on my own predictions and resisting well-intentioned programs like the UN's affiliated Playing for the Planet initiative, which brings video game companies together to insert green content into their games. And let me just say, we could have a lot of kinds of partial Earth games. This is a little game jam game from the 2020 Indiecade Climate Game Jam by Seth Paxton and Ben Ash. I think I was a mentor for this, but it's like you're a benevolent alien that kind of stumbles on our polluted planet and then sucks up pollution for us, which is kind of nice. But it's like, the Earth is toy. It's kind of a different perspective. There's this game Dorfromantik, which was created by German students. It's very pastoral, very kind of Euro, but has a kind of interesting regional element to it. Like you can have lavender fields and other biomes. The game Wandering Village, I'm very into. I recommend it highly, but you basically have to live on the back of a giant creature called an onbu, and you both have to survive a toxic atmosphere and eat and thrive together, and you have to balance this. Atuel is a documentary game that was modeled on the Atuel River watershed in Argentina. The game cooperative Matajuegos that created it is started as a blog and is now defunct, but it's a really beautiful game where you are sometimes like water or a cloud or a fish or a fox, and you travel down the waterway, and it's really moving. Artist Alice Bucknell has this magisterial film/game called The Alluvials, which is based on the Los Angeles region. And High Country News called it the video game that makes the climate apocalypse look good. So I don't think that was her intention, but this is my favorite level, which is the Yucca Moth level. So there's like Hoover Dam in the background, but you play both as the Joshua Tree and also the pollinator that's specialized for it. And then, I think I'll just say that partial Earth games might also draw attention to devices and infrastructures that games rely on. So like literally partial Earth. A lot of really great work has been done on this recently in environmental media studies. And an example of that might be Bart Simon created a game called Gaia's Riddle based on Minecraft, but it's powered by a solar server called Sunblock One. And they've installed a heads-up display that basically visualizes energy use for players and ties play to environmental conditions. So doing this, they actually discovered that when you fly in Minecraft, you consume a lot more energy. So I'll just end there. Thanks. All right.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you for all the careful organizing and and work that's gone into this event. Today I'm going to share a body of work that has been made over the past 5 or 6 years. But first of all, I want to start with this book. I want to take us back to 2015. John Durham Peters, The Marvelous Clouds, has been very inspiring for my work and my thinking. And Peters makes this argument for, he argues that we tend to think about media too narrowly. It's commonly thought of screens, devices, channels for sending messages. But he draws on an older philosophical tradition where media, where a medium is thought as the container for anything that happens at all. So the thing that makes any signal, any exchange, and any event possible. And so by that account, the ocean is medium, the sky is medium, the planet has always been medium. And yet our current technological infrastructure, of course, is designed to make us forget that. And so this idea of elemental media is something I carry through some of these works we'll talk about. And I'm going to share 3 projects today that, again, do not offer this view of a planet as an entity to be modelled or imaged, but rather it attempts to position the planet as an active agent, as something to be negotiated with. Of course, many of our infrastructures historically treat the environment as something to be overcome, latency to minimise, weather to route around or insulate against. And the 3 projects we'll look at today attempt to do the opposite. So they try to treat planetary conditions such as the sun's position, the atmosphere, the carbon cycle as a logic, as signals which carry meaning, value, and action. And so this approach to practice, so I'm an artist with a background in environmental engineering, so I'm very interested in engineering as a field. So I call my practice eccentric engineering. And this involves the sort of public prototyping of off-centre systems where I attempt to sort of displace exclusively human agendas and work with environmental processes as co-designer. So it's not so much an anti-technological stance, but I'm attempting to try to author a different relationship to technology grounded in different values. And it's also a place where I'm trying to bring like critique and proposal together into the same space. So an attempt to expand what we think of as engineering and what engineering might be, taking it beyond a project of optimization, which is often how engineers think about their work. And I want to ask, what does engineering as argument look like? So a dominant imaginary for the planet is still one where it's thought of as resource, as something to be modelled, something for data to be harvested from. Representation is typically from above. We've had Haraway mentioned already, the satellite view, the model, Earth 2 by NVIDIA. This is something that's very much still alive in mainstream sort of environmental tech discourse. Peters might call this the semantic tradition of media, where the planet is content to be captured and transmitted rather than active agent to be negotiated with. Also true of digital media, which is typically where the digital infrastructure behind it is typically rendered invisible. The computation is still often thought of as infinite, as immaterial, the internet arriving from nowhere. And obviously, this shift in awareness of the infrastructural back-end to our computation is happening through the enormous materiality of AI and data centers like this one. Elon Musk also already mentioned today, so this is his Memphis data center, and this thermal image shows all of the methane energy production that has sort of been wheeled up to in order to train Grok. And so what other ways can we think about this? What would happen if you try and let planetary conditions govern a system, if we try to actually bring them into decision-making and infrastructure? And that's the question that has driven this project, Solar Protocol. Begun around 2021, and we're still working on it. And in collaboration with Alex Nathanson and Benedetta Piantella. And this is both artwork and infrastructure. It's a planetary network of solar-powered servers that collectively hosts a web platform that you can visit at solarprotocol.net. And the web platform gets sent to you from whichever server is in the most sunshine at the time. So it's a big collaborative project. A solar server, just a very simple small-scale computer powered by a solar panel. If you run one of these by themselves, of course, it's intermittent. It's very, whether the website is up or down, very dependent on weather conditions and traffic and computational load. But we started experimenting with these servers. This is our Stuart Graham in Australia. And we wrote some custom networking software that actually means that if one server has gone down, another server will take its place wherever there is sort of the most naturally occurring energy around the planet. It's always sunny somewhere. So yes, here you see we sent we recruited volunteers around the world and sent them servers to put together, spent a lot of time on calls, and building this project really taught me so much about how that social dimension of infrastructure. A lot of our servers go offline all the time, being community run, but often the reason they go offline is because, someone breaks up with their partner and the server's on the balcony and they can't get to it and they're not going to be able to get to it for 6 months. And so this very social situation that we live in, and then, that is that layer of infrastructure, influences that layer of infrastructure. So the project reconfigures the DNS protocol, and decisions about where internet traffic is sent and what content is displayed are automated according to an environmental logic derived from weather, season, geography, path of the sun. We wrote some custom networking software, and each server is always checking in with the others, saying, are you receiving more sunlight than me? And if the answer is yes, the active server shifts. So if you visit the website, it'll come from different parts of the planet at different times of the day and year. We're not the first ones to kind of think about this. This has sometimes been called follow the sun computing in computer science literature, but to my knowledge, this is sort of one of the first projects that's tried to build it at a community level. So the sun's path along its climate interaction becomes a routing algorithm. Decisions about the network's operation here aren't automated by machine learning or a model. You could imagine that could be one way you could build a system like this, but instead we work with the environment itself. We enlist the sun as the logic by which decisions about where the website is served from and where the computation. Is also exploring this idea of governance not by simulation, not by digital twin, but rather by protocol. And this obviously has a long tradition. To give you an example, Robin Wall-Kimmerer has written extensively on a North American Indigenous land management protocol called the Honourable Harvest. That is practices and philosophy that guide the manner in which we take from the living world, protocols of asking permission, evaluating impact, taking only what you need, using appropriate technology, demonstrating respect, and reciprocating the gift. So she writes about this protocol, which consists of a number of rules. For example, like never take the first plant you see of a kind of species, never take more than half, never take the last plant. And what these seemingly straightforward rules ensure is that you're never over harvesting from a region if you're harvesting resources from it. But instead of having to build an accurate simulation and collect perfect data sets so that we understand and can model what's happening, you follow these rules and you have this sort of protocol of extraction that is more sustainable than what we're doing currently. And so Solar Protocol models this similar ethics, right? It's a system also governed by just a very simple protocol that automatically curtails operations based on the energy a location can produce itself and offers a step towards this kind of approach. Of course, it still relies on extractive systems. We still rely on the internet. It's still using computing. But I think it's trying to open up an imaginary for another way that we could design our computational systems, our infrastructures, and place more value on trying to work within planetary limits. Just a couple more images. That's our server in LA that's run by Rhizome. So we do a lot of collaborations now with art organizations who use the space, the digital space, to launch projects or do experiments. So there's a couple of online exhibitions on the server, but we're also very open to work or experiments that people might want to do with this system. The servers have an API, so the solar data is available from the different locations. And really we think about it as this sort of digital artist-run space that's running on solar. So it's like an alternative cloud. Okay, another mechanism for scaling logics of resource use is that of the marketplace, which brings me to this next work called Offset, collaboration with Sam Levine, where we set out to explore carbon registries, carbon markets, and ended up developing our own carbon marketplace. So carbon offsets are actions that are intended to compensate for carbon emissions to the atmosphere. They get listed on registries and traded on carbon marketplaces. Now, again, there's a history of market-based approaches to environmental management that we can trace back to a big moment in this history is 1990 with the launch of the Clean Air Act by George Bush. And this is a history we've explored in this work, and I'm going to play you a little excerpt of a video, a single-channel video that that is part of the piece. Hopefully. Oh, I'm not. It looks like my video file is missing. I'm sorry. So, oh no, it is working.
Up next, we take you to the White House for coverage of the Clean Air Bill signing ceremony that occurred earlier today. President Bush signed the document in the East Room.
This bill is both ambitious in its goals and innovative in its methods. For the first time, we've moved away from the red tape, bureaucratic approach of the past. The old tradition of command and control regulation is not the answer. By relying on the marketplace, we can achieve the ambitious environmental goals we have as a country in the most efficient and cost-effective way possible. It's time for a new kind of environmentalism, driven by the knowledge that a sound ecology and a strong economy can coexist.
It began with a simple idea that the market could solve what politics could not, that the invisible forces of commodity and capital accumulation would be applied to carbon itself, incentivizing those who could remove it and penalizing those who could not. Carbon offsetting is the result. Offsets are financial products representing actions that compensate for carbon emissions to the atmosphere. For example, your Microsoft. Your new data center emits X tons of carbon per year. I own a forest. The forest absorbs X tons of carbon per year. You buy the carbon that my forest absorbs as carbon credits. The carbon emissions from your data center are now compensated, neutralized, or offset by the carbon that my forest has absorbed. Carbon offsetting injects market logic into thin air. It demands that certain activities become measured and standardized, reduced to the single dimension of the carbon dioxide molecule. The goal is fungibility, to assert that emissions created over here can be traded and theoretically compensated for by actions removing or reducing carbon over there. The means is, of course, commodification. Offsets privatize planetary metabolism.
So that's just a little snippet of what is a 12-minute video that sort of takes you into more of the research behind the project. Thank you, George Bush. You lent us your voice as our narrator. But we also got very interested in this idea of like what financializing environmental interactions does. Sarah Bracking, a British economist, gives us this quote and this contribution. Promises of money from global institutions and governments have financialized people's hopes and expectations of government action to adapt to climate change and slow the emission of greenhouse gases. Because of the cultural power of money in our understanding of the world, climate finance has had the particular job of signifying action while delivering very little. And so she's a professor of climate and society at King's College. And we got very interested in this idea of the cultural power of money. And so the process of converting real-world actions into credits is one of data collection, quantification, and calculation. So net zero is, of course, a massive computational challenge. But it relies on this cultural power of money. And then offsets become this space where the dream of like infinite computing and the expansion of computing and computability mixes with this promise of finance. So both imaginaries here. So we did a lot of research of existing carbon markets and existing carbon methodologies, particularly those used in the forestry industry. As the forestry industry has developed mechanisms for creating carbon credits from temporarily storing carbon, and they call this tenure accounting. So tenure accounting can be used to calculate the benefits of temporarily storing carbon. For example, say I own a forest and I say, I'm not going to cut down that forest for 10 years. They have figured out a way to say that this delay can be counted as carbon credits because it assumes that carbon emitted later is better than carbon emitted now. So the claim that delaying emissions is beneficial rests on a lot of shaky assumptions. This approach is highly criticised. And it's the assumptions around like the well-being of future generations that we can discount this and that technologies of the future will be better and will be in better shape to remove carbon later, right? And so despite the criticism around this approach, big carbon registries like Vera have ratified it, and it's also been adopted by governments in their offsetting practices, so that's not great. However, when we did this research, we also realised that there were a lot of actions that had significant carbon benefits that also would kind of function as a form of temporary carbon storage. For example, in 2021, a group in Australia called Blockade Australia shut down the biggest coal port in the world for 2 weeks. And through their action, they effectively made the port store the carbon for that time because it would have otherwise been exported and combusted. And so from this vantage point, techniques like tenure accounting let us turn direct actions like this one into carbon credits, just by using very standard industry approaches. And so that was the underlying basis of Offset, and here's our promotional video.
Most people believe that industrial sabotage destroys value. They're wrong. Today, sabotage creates value. Introducing Offset, the world's first platform to transform industrial sabotage into premium carbon credits. Using rigorous scientific methodology, we calculate how much carbon is saved when activists sabotage infrastructure. We convert these savings into carbon credit commodities and then funnel the proceeds directly back to the activist. Offset your emissions. Create real value. Buy a carbon credit today.
And so we have a white paper with our methodology. You can visit the registry. And the carbon credit certificates look like this, so they're quite lovely. So if anyone wants to buy one, let me know. If anyone has connections to Microsoft or any of these tech companies claiming net zero, that's our ultimate goal, is to sell some to them. So finally, I'm just going to quickly show you the sort of a project also in this Offset series and then wrap up that continues our exploration of sabotage and its carbon benefits. Sabotage, perhaps best defined by Labor leader Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, is the withdrawal of efficiency with the aim of affecting the profits of the boss. So we started to ask whether an artwork or climate art could do more than sort of represent the challenges we face. Could we actually have a work invite an audience to participate in sabotage? So we got very interested in this approach called time theft, right? Time theft, where you basically waste time on the job. You take long lunch breaks, you take phone calls, you sleep. And whether this approach would produce carbon savings if it was imposed on the highest emitting industries. So what would it take to sort of immobilise, say, executives working in the energy and extraction industries, and what kind of carbon benefits might come from that? And so this project, Cold Call, takes the form of a call centre, and audiences are invited to sit down and work in the call centre. And you're connected to an executive in the oil and gas industry in the US, and you're instructed to waste as much of their time as possible. So it turns out you can buy phone numbers for people in specific industries. So we used some of our production budget to buy 1,000 phone numbers of CEOs and people in that industry. $1 a number, so not bad. And then if you sit down, you're sort of guided through making a phone call. You're given a link to Paul's LinkedIn address. You can look at call histories if he's been rung before. And we also offer conversation aids, icebreakers, things you might want to talk to Paul about if you have a bit of phone fear. So poems, there's a sort of guided meditation where you can lead Paul through and make an offset together. We also have a leaderboard in the space. So the longest call, 39 minutes, pretty impressive. And it shows you who's been recently called. So Cold Call treats executive time as a medium to be intercepted. Time theft for those in high-emitting industry is reframed as a measurable intervention in the carbon cycle. So the telephone, the script, the hold music, the duration, all of these become planetary instruments. So where Offset applies the counting apparatus to pass acts of direct action, Cold Call puts it in the audience's hand in real time. It's just a real hit with the kids as well. So the work insists on action and action becoming carbon credit. The gallery visitor is not outside the planet looking in, but an active agent shaping it. And so to conclude, I'll just play a little excerpt from one of the calls.
Good afternoon, Council Wagner Service. How may I help you?
Hello, good afternoon. May I please speak to Corey Noland?
Now, the office is closed on the weekend. Did you want to leave a message?
Okay. I would like to leave a poem. Is that possible?
A poem?
A poem.
Okay. So,
okay, will you
let's
write this
see
down?
here.
Can you write this down?
Sure.
Yes. Okay, are you ready to read the poem?
I am.
Okay, here it comes. Alas, said the mouse, the whole world is growing smaller every day. At the beginning, it was so big that I was afraid. I kept running and running, and I was glad when I saw walls far away to the right and left. But these long walls have narrowed so quickly that I am in the last chamber already. And there in the corner stands the trap that I must run into. You only need to change your direction, said the cat, and ate it up. Please leave that for Corey. Thank you. Have an amazing day, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amelin, for organizing this fantastic event. I'm super excited to hear the rest of the talks, and those this morning have been wonderful. And thanks for the team here at GSAPP for making this seamless. So today, I want to briefly outline a few kind of tendencies relative to architecture's role in thinking about planetary and environmental media. The first set of themes draws on an edited volume Amelin mentioned that I recently completed, and then I'm going to try to tease out some of those themes with two design projects from my practice. So architecture as environmental media, rendering the planetary, is an edited volume exploring the relationship between climate change, environment, and representation in design production today. The contributions to the volume are organized into three sort of threads of media practice, which we've heard kind of a lot about already today. Rendering visible, rendering sensible, and rendering actionable. In part one, chapters reveal environmental conditions made invisible by the dominant forces of capital and development. In part two, rendering sensible, chapters delve into alternative sensing regimes that help us engage in our environments in new ways. And in part three, rendering actionable, chapters seek to chart new forms of agency against extractive systems towards new modes of production. These are obviously inherently intertwined tactics, and they can help, hopefully, to develop new knowledge systems, shift aesthetic regimes, and transform our collective agency as designers. But I wanted to briefly outline a few of the themes from the introduction of the book, just as a way to get started. They kind of set the groundwork for thinking about these categories of visibility, sensibility, and action. We've seen images like this today already, but as art historian and environmental theorist Emily Eliza Scott argues, most climate-related media fall into two broad categories. The first elicits an empathetic response to a tragic or localized condition, or the kind of micro condition, like polar bears sitting on top of waning ice sheets. And the second zooms out to the top-down scientific macro view of the transforming Earth, or the techno-sublime. To Scott, neither sufficiently captures the intimate and transcalar causes and effects of climate change, and each oversimplifies the intricacy of issues, relying instead on emotional or scientifically objective mechanisms. To put the problem another way, our climate media can be read as kind of either too hot or too cool. In reference to the media coverage of the 2024 LA fires, art historian and critic T.J. Demos, also Bridget Schneider's kind of burning cartographies that Emlyn mentioned earlier, but T.J. Demos argues that these images represent what he terms as a burning aesthetic, a spectacularizing barrage of incendiary coverage resulting in what he calls the insufficiency of the image. He continues, quote, "They constitute indisputable facts on the ground, but remain unclear in significance, as if fire burns meaning itself." On the flip side, the coolness of techno-solutionism, or I guess in architecture can say greenwashing of the built environment, results in a media landscape that Esther Choi claims, quote, "naturalizes capitalism," offering a branded seduction as a return to nature that excuses unchecked development, wealth inequality, and financialized capitalism, all generators of our climate rift. Of course, these tactics serve their functions and purposes in a variety of ways, but perhaps we can identify some other tendencies that might help situate us amidst our entangled conditions, what I'm calling kind of between the impossible and the possible, which I'll get into in a moment. So I use a few artifacts in the introduction to delve into this visibility, sensibility, and action. So I'm going to go through the first one, of rendering visible, just to keep it brief. On the left is one of 36 monumental photographs of floral bouquets by artist Taryn Simon from her series Paperwork and the Will of Capital from 2015. It depicts a reproduction of a flower arrangement present at the signing of the 2008 Tree Lords Settlement Act, the most significant land transfer in New Zealand's history, returning tribal land taken during British colonization to the collective ownership of Maori tribes. Each photograph in the series recreates the flowers and color palettes present at the signing of these critical kind of geopolitical treaties, declarations, or decrees. The photographs are a counter project, also in her words, to the 17th century Dutch still life painting type known as the impossible bouquet, which features an arrangement of abundant botanical specimens like flowers, fruits, insects that could never bloom, fruit, or exist simultaneously in nature. With specimens separated by time and geography, these synthetic environmental constructs emerged from the rise of global capitalism and the expansion of colonial botanical and horticultural trades during the Dutch Golden Age. Painting like the one on the right, paintings like this, Jan van Huysum's Still Life with Flowers and Fruit, articulated these disparate colonial bounties with meticulous precision and realism, rendering visible the planetary scale of the Dutch East India Company's colonial empire. Simon's botanical arrangements, by contrast, synthesize these histories of colonialism, geopolitical relations, land exploitation, and the shifting agents of environmental care into the bouquet and supporting documentation. I think that the impossible bouquet is a pretty apt metaphor for architecture. The Dutch greenhouses and flower auctions from which Simon sourced the bouquets and all of the work in the exhibition, those greenhouses pictured on the left are composed of aluminum made from bauxite refined in the Caribbean, glass made from silica in Australia, polycarbonate sheets processed in Spain, concrete with cement from Michigan, rubber sealant using oil from Saudi Arabia, among others, many others. In another counter project, an artist like Lara Almersegui reveals such material relationships by rendering visceral the scale, quantity, and mass of the construction process by decomposing the architectural object into its constituent parts. Stacks of drywall, mounds of gravel, CMU blocks, steel extrusions are placed within the gallery, their material characteristics heightened. The chalkiness of the gravel, the weight of the rubble, the graphics of the drywall. It's a raw image of architecture's impossible bouquet, broken down into commodities and extracted materials. So media practices like Simon's and Almersegui's give us insight into how architects might reframe our planetary relations through design as a medium. Such practices demand information and narrative-rich formats, neither macro or micro, not too hot, not too cool, requiring investigation, care, and time to produce, and equally intense modes of viewership to engage and understand. More than ever, as we feel our forms of agency shrinking, with the facts of anthropogenic climate change under fire, deploying novel tactics of this kind of communication is critical to imagine a possible bouquet of techniques and tactics of media. So architecture might be a rough steward or a blunt instrument, I guess, of these ideas, mobilizing material systems and capital that often work against our intentions. But I hope, at least, that design has the capacity to project and reframe and re-engage the way that we understand our world. So to that end, I'm going to share a few projects from my design practice home office, which I work on with my partner Brittany Udding, who's an assistant professor at Rice University. I'm going to begin with one called Field Station, which is an architectural experiment that explores the spatial practices of forest governance, environmental sensing, and climate care. The forest has always been a critical site of resource extraction, political struggle, and environmental reform. From the Charter of the Forest of 1217 that granted commoners access to the forests in medieval England, to contemporary activist movements such as Alenda, the civil disobedience group occupying the Hambach forest in Germany's Rhineland to protect it from nearby mining, which we saw in previous presentation, to the Muskogee peoples and the forest defenders protesting against Cop City in Atlanta, to the incorporation of the Rights of Nature Clause in Ecuador's 2008 Constitution, the outcome of decades-long activist struggles against extraction and pollution in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the forest persists as a revolutionary site of political struggle. To aid in these struggles, often, field stations, sensor networks, data sharing platforms, DIY toolkits are increasingly empowering citizen scientists to engage in positive climate education, ecological encounter, and also action. Shown here, Jennifer Gabris's ongoing Smart Forests project deploys sensors in experimental forests to demystify sensing technologies for an expanded public. Or in the ongoing struggle between against Chevron Texaco over its pollution of the Amazon, prosecutors continuously gather environmental data as evidence of ecological catastrophe. As Ursula Byman and Paulo Tavares recount in their amazing project, Forest Law, quote, the forest was converted into a juridical court and vast technical laboratory. Such projects frame the forest not only as an ecosystem, but also a living lab, collecting data to protect ecological sovereignty. However, such technologies and practices emerged from contested histories. Many scientific outposts, field stations, weather stations, and botanical research sites emerged from imperial, settler colonial, and corporate incursions and extraction. Field stations deployed to study the tropics and the global south mobilized local knowledge for agricultural development and the identification of natural resources, and established territorial power through data gathering and mapping. Seen here, the survey tower stations and maps of the Great Trigonometric Survey conducted by the East India Company in the early 1800s rendered the environment legible for colonial control. Historian Mega Raby describes how the United States established a network of field stations staffed by American scientists and researchers throughout the colonized tropical regions to observe ecosystems and establish plantations. Despite these histories, the critical research conducted at these sites helps us understand the local effects of environmental destruction and climate change. In the parallel projects of decolonization and environmental care, can the field station offer a powerful space for climate action? Pictured here as part of the Indigenous Guardians Initiative launched in 2017 by the Canadian government, it provides funding to support projects like the Scotty Creek Field Station, which is the first Indigenous-led field station in Canada, which helps to conserve millions of acres of land and ocean, supporting partnerships between scientists and First Nations people to monitor climate impacts on the region. These initiatives can help harness environmental data and traditional ecological knowledge to respond to destructive extraction, illegal logging, land treaty violations, and unmonitored pollution across a variety of ecosystems. Scotty Creek, that example specifically provides an example of the urgency of some of these activities, because in October of 2022, a wildfire swept through the preserve, consuming much of the landscape and destroying the field station structures and equipment. While they are rebuilding, these events are becoming more common, and field stations are increasingly precarious institutions because of unreliable funding sources, difficulty securing land, and partisan environmental policies. Yet only by gathering site-specific data through experiments and kind of multi-generational long-term projects can we fully start to get a grip of the ecological damage of colonization, extraction, and the conditions, the specific on-the-ground conditions that are resulting in the forest. So to bring these to a sort of architectural imaginary, Field Station proposes a prototype that explores the spatial practices of climate action and forest care. The project was a public art piece commissioned by the Sam Fox School of Design at Washington University in St. Louis. The conceptual site for this design experiment is the Sam Houston National Forest, just north of Houston, Texas. Before colonization by Spanish, French, and Anglo settlers, people had occupied this land for over 12,000 years, specifically the Acoquisa tribes in the San Jacinto and Trinity River basins. The terrain is a rich assemblage of ecologies that make up the East Texas piney woods region. Stands of loblolly pines, bottomland hardwoods, deciduous forested wetlands, rivers, swamps, and coastal prairies. Beneath the surface are uranium-bearing strata, Eocene and Paleocene oil fields, and quartz-rich industrial sands. These geologies are governed by the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, ensuring the balanced management of forest resources. It's a highly managed territory, this patchwork of public and private property, camping, farming, mining, extraction, timber. And within this context, we're thinking about what a citizen scientist sort of field station or activist climate camp might look like. So we started looking at a field station that already exists there, which is the Sam Houston State University Biological Research Center, located on a former WPA fish hatchery. The site, which is an amazing and kind of haphazard assemblage of structures and experimental plots, was intended to support, in their words, the biodiversity and abundance of forest ecosystems for research purposes. Obviously, this is a difficult process with shoestring budgets and ongoing deed and property disputes with oil speculators around the borders of the field station. So some of the projects are a bit derelict, like this overgrown mesocosm experiment on the right. And I wanted to do a brief digression. Alenda mentioned mesocosms, and so I wanted to kind of define it and dig into it a little bit because we've been researching them a lot as well. A mesocosm is a middle world. It's an infrastructure for outdoor ecological experiments. Quote, these mesocosms are middle-sized worlds falling between the laboratory microcosm and the large, complex, real-world macrocosms. Between the planetary and the laboratory, they allow scientists to observe ecosystems while immersed in the site. Often found in these kinds of field stations, they are infrastructures for simulating the consequences of environmental disruption and climate change on ecosystems. We've been kind of visiting them over the last year to understand their spatial practices and how the design process brings them into being, and learn from their immersive sensorial environments that they create. To share just two of them, this one is the Metatron in southern France, which is an array of 48 environmental patches that help study the behavior of species migration, metapopulations, and grasslands under climate stress. And the Spruce Experiment in the Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota, which studies the response of spruce and peatland ecosystems under elevated CO2 levels. So in this experiment, scientists increase air and ground temperature and CO2 levels within 17 enclosures and observe what happens inside. As you can see on the door to one of these experiments, it says, "Welcome to a warmer future, plus 9 degrees Celsius," which is, if we're following anything about climate change, that's a pretty extreme condition. That implies absolute global devastation, right? And the results of some of these are surprising, right? That all of a sudden more blueberries are produced, for example, in the peat bog when there's higher CO2, but then also the plants are significantly more susceptible to pests and other things like that. So they're surprising results. So can this idea of the mesocosm replace or engage with this macro binary that we discussed earlier? Scientist and philosopher Isabel Stengers similarly argues that the macro is so zoomed out, it obscures the specificity of a condition, while the micro is so zoomed in, it becomes difficult to see the relationships between larger systems. Instead, she says, quote, "The meso is a site of invention, where the pragmatics of the question are more alive, more vivid, and more difficult to forget than the micro or the macro, which traditionally plays a game of truth. The meso must create itself, and each time the meso affirms its co-presence with a milieu." So I think this might offer a way to reorient our environmental thinking towards a less controlled, more lively, and increasingly entangled spatial practice. So returning to the field station, we gathered the documents, maps, research findings into a field guide to the forest. The landscape required a kind of non-linear document to reflect the contested and contingent practices that define the landscape. From archaeological digs to ecological preserves, scanning, patents, to governance documents, these test landscapes and extraction sites, the document is a guide through this messy terrain. In this contested landscape of politics and ecology, of colonial ghosts and extractive presence, the project imagines how architecture might engage with some of these ideas of sensing and action. Equipped with a multitude of sensors, the field stations can measure ecological disturbance or pollution emissions, serve as operating bases for scientists or an outpost for meetings of local networks of activists or volunteers. What would a future landscape of these kinds of spaces feel like? Can their role be expanded from monitoring habitat distress to providing ground support for agitation against destructive logging or federal concessions for oil and minerals? A kind of ultralight, multi-material structure, the field station is full of research documents, a map of a blockaded mine, hanging laundry, a reseeding experiment, lab equipment, a space for data gathering, sensor troubleshooting, experimentation, organizing, and pedagogy. The low-tech, light-touch, easy-to-build assembly requires minimal site prep and can adapt to various terrains. The envelope is a layered, operable mesh and fabric panel, while the roof is adjustable for light, air, and rainwater collection. Temporary or semi-permanent, packable and demountable, the field station is designed to be there one day and gone the next. Troves of guides and surveys, half-finished circuits, places to rest, immersed in a lush understory of ferns and fungi. The tableaus we put together tried to imagine sort of joyous new protocols for stewardship of the forest. So the idea is it's a kind of open-ended architecture that might serve ground-up practices of eco-political power, enabling activists, citizen scientists, and researchers to respond in real time to habitat disturbance and mobilize agendas for long-term practices of environmental care. So very briefly to finish, moving from the forest to the city, I wanted to show one more project, Open Ground, which is an ongoing proposal that we're working on at the moment. So this is research sort of in progress. The project begins with a common structure in public parks, the covered sport court. It provides crucial shade and rain cover in Houston's subtropical climate. We became interested in how this simple structure could be retooled to serve as a more robust public climate infrastructure, one that could address the increasing intensity of storms, flooding, and heat, in addition to its community function. Another speculative site that we picked is located adjacent to the former Ingraham Gully, the dark splotch in the middle in Houston's greater Fifth Ward. Over its history, the site has hosted a variety of semi-toxic programs, brickworks, metal casting foundries, which has kind of contaminated the ground. So it's a super fun site that is now at the end of its remediation process. So it's almost complete today. Its urban context and hydrology shows all of its kind of connections to the broader hydrological relations, storm inlets, and flooding. And the idea is that the project that we're working on kind of taps into these histories and infrastructures by proposing two structures that sort of link this, the formerly exposed gully, through a process of first daylighting the gully and then producing this piece of leisure space right adjacent to it, especially since new townhomes are being developed on the site right now. So while a standard sport court provides shade, we're interested in how the topology could provide additional utility during high heat seasons and between flood events. Fundamentally, it asks, how can climate infrastructure function beyond shelter? Above ground, it's a sort of multi-use, reconfigurable hardscape protected by the shade structure above. And then these two utility cores connect the structure to a below ground system of tubular chambers that are stormwater infrastructure that they're installing all over the Southeast Texas and Central Texas region currently, and in other places that have extreme weather events. So basically, these towers can pull air down into this plenum of cooler air when it's empty, so that it's the cool, dry air then can be pushed up into the sport court space, or alternatively, when it's wet, the water can be filtered, captured, and then reused at a later time. The solar roof is also kind of full of recycled and natural insulation, functioning as a lightweight thermal barrier to slow heat gain in the space below. So to conclude, architecture often treats the surface of the earth and the planet as a liminal plane to break and excavate, to cut and fill, to smooth into a neutral line. What happens when architecture confronts the messy substrates of the city and the landscape, utility infrastructures, soil ecosystems, and geological worlds? How can architecture render visible these strata through design? Close to the surface, water mains, pipelines, geothermal networks cut through layers of clay and sand from an ancient seabed. Deeper still drifts the ghostly figure of an oil deposit, the compressed remains of the vegetal mass from an older carbon-rich world. The microbial bloom of subterranean life encrusts the fissures and the cracks of the bedrock, industriously consuming veins of minerals and ores. The project's underbelly of pipes, beams, and piles entangles architecture within this planetary stack. So Open Ground and Field Station take the position that architecture has a role to play in projecting these new relationships between public life and terrestrial systems, mediating a site's geologies, ecosystems, hydrologies, and atmospheres. We hope such projects entangle us in a possible bouquet of mesocosmic tactics, offering a space to gather among the trees and beneath the sun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I really enjoyed listening to the presentations before mine, and I look forward to the discussion. My book, Floating Power, came out this past week, and so I'm very excited to share some sections of the book here. And again, happy to answer any questions about the book in the Q&A. Okay. So across convention centers worldwide, energy industry professionals and policymakers repeat the significance of energy justice, often referring to the necessity of carbon-based fuels as a tool for development. And in the early 2000s, representatives of the fossil fuel industry often claimed that climate change was not anthropogenic, citing historical transformations in the planet's climate, such as the Little Ice Age, and obfuscating the role that fossil fuel production and consumption have played in instigating climate change. However, in the 2020s, this discourse has given way to a perspective that emphasizes energy justice, coupling the emergence of equity and development with the consumption of fossil fuels. So adopting an energy justice framework has given the fossil fuel industry a new moral valence. And here you can see an image from CERAWeek, which is an energy conference in Houston that I've been following for the past few years, and it attracts about 10,000 energy industry executives and is an important site for sort of the geopolitics of the energy industry. So in rendering energy justice achievable as a goal, decision makers point to the development of fossil fuel infrastructure in the global south, which would help countries industrialize and therefore prosper. This emphasis on all of the above solutions, basically extracting all energy sources, including fossil fuels and renewables, to ensure a stable and secure energy supply, shared by policymakers from the global south and professionals from the fossil fuel industry, defers the implementation of impactful climate change mitigation strategies. So in Floating Power, I investigate how this all of the above approach makes itself known in the global south by focusing on the emergence of Car Power's floating power plant in Ghana, alongside solar power stations and electric vehicles. So a central theoretical contribution of the book is the concept of energy accumulation. So I argue against the dominant unilinear narrative of energy transition, which evokes the possibility of substituting fossil fuels with renewables. So instead, my work in Turkey and Ghana reveals a landscape of accumulation where various types of infrastructure, hydroelectric, heavy fuel oil, natural gas, and solar, layer upon one another. And this all of the above approach relies upon and reproduces what I call technologies of deferral, such as the power ship. I should show you an image of the power ship. I'll show it to you soon, which are perceived as temporary stopgaps, but often become semi-permanent fixtures. So although many energy sector representatives value the all of the above approach, a close examination of the dynamics among energy professionals in Ghana, Turkey, and beyond reveals that subscribing to this approach does not, in fact, create a level playing field for these diverse actors. As I outline in the book, geopolitical and geoeconomic differences between countries, meaning countries' varying capacities to utilize geographic resources, or economic investments to expand their global influence shape the terms of engagement between actors from various countries, further entrenching unequal relationships. Even when technologies of arrival associated with post-oil modernity, such as solar power stations and electric vehicles, are put to use, the dynamics of inequality persist. So with this very brief summary of the book's main goals in mind, let me introduce to you electric cars and how they fit this broader context. Okay. So in April 2022, during her 10-day stay in Houston, Texas, Doris Agbevivi did some sightseeing around her hotel and was impressed with the number of luxury electric vehicles parked on driveways outside single-family homes. Doris, which you see in the picture here, was an energy economist in her early 30s and had been working with Ghana's Energy Commission for several years, coordinating their Drive Electric initiative. We had spent time together in Accra in late 2019 and early 2020 while I conducted fieldwork on the emergence of the Turkish-owned Car Power floating power plant and tracked its impact on Ghana's electricity grid. Throughout the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, Doris and I chatted on WhatsApp, brainstorming ways she could visit Rice and give a talk about her work with the Energy Commission. So Doris was very well known among energy professionals in Ghana, and people often called her Miss EV. After working as an auditor for Ernst & Young for a year, she had joined the Energy Commission as an energy analyst in 2016. 3 years later, she became the program coordinator for the Drive Electric initiative, promoting electric vehicle ownership among Ghanaian drivers. Most of the time, she worked on the Drive Electric initiative alone, which gave her independence, and she was the go-to person for anyone who wished to learn about transport electrification in Ghana. So in Ghana, Doris faced a tricky situation. The excess electricity resulting from investments in various fossil fuel-powered power plants had created a new set of financial problems. A network of actors, including government agencies, established companies, emergent startups, and interested individuals with widely varying political and social ideals, had reformulated the condition of electricity excess to enable the emergence of electric vehicle infrastructure, which would be capable of consuming this excess electricity. The move to develop electric vehicle infrastructure diverged from the established flow of goods associated with the linear energy transition timeline, where global south countries like Ghana serve as a dumping grounds for the global north's old gas-powered cars, and challenge the presupposed temporality of electric vehicle infrastructure grounded in global north contexts. In doing so, it pushed back against the dominant timeline of development. By opting for new affordable vehicles, such as the Chinese Aura Black Cat, which I'll talk about more in a bit, Ghana further strengthened its ties with Chinese companies. Decision makers such as Doris often found themselves defending their choices and explaining why, say, the Norwegian or Danish model of electric car adoption, which incentivizes electric vehicles to manage renewable energy-powered grids, is not the only way to promote transport electrification. All in all, the implementation of electric transport in Ghana reoriented the global north's chronology of energy infrastructure development and forged an alternative material politics with future potential. So in developing the Drive Electric initiative, Doris responded to a particular context of electricity excess. Electricity excess is surplus electrical energy that must be discarded, mainly because it cannot be used to satisfy existing consumer demand on the grid or to charge batteries. Contemporary debates regarding energy often focus on electricity excess generated through the mass installation of renewable energy power stations. For instance, a solar farm might produce excess electricity at midday, but demand is more likely to be higher in the evening when consumers run a range of appliances. However, this typical portrayal of excess did not characterize the Ghanaian grid. From 2012 to 2015, Ghana experienced an electricity crisis known as Dumsor, resulting in extensive load shedding nationwide. To address Dumsor, the Electricity Company of Ghana, the primary electricity distributor serving the country's southern region, entered into 43 power purchase agreements with various vendors from Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and China. Between 2015 and 2019, Ghana's electricity supply surged from 2,800 megawatts, which was in line with the demand placed on the grid, to over 5,000 megawatts. The introduction of new power plants led to an overcapacity of fossil fuel-powered electricity on the national grid, which in turn created unforeseen environmental, financial, and political challenges. In conceptualizing Drive Electric, Doris considered various electrification plans, including increasing household electricity consumption through appliances like air conditioners. But she recognized that such plans depended on creating consumer demand for products that were not popular in contemporary Ghana and did not necessarily lead to emission reductions. It's a luxury for most people, she said, as we sat in a heavily air-conditioned cafe in Houston during her visit in April 2022. Why pick it up when they already have a fan? Doris saw Ghana's overcapacity issue as an opportunity to shape how Ghanaians used electricity. What were other ways to absorb electricity? Transport, she said. There were millions of cars on the street. What if in the next 20 or 10 years, half of these cars became electric? What would that mean for us? Gas-powered cars already had a central place in everyday life, so electric vehicles could serve as a substitute. Drive Electric initiative was launched with these aspirations in 2019. Yet the developers of Drive Electric knew that their plans did not follow the typical path for integrating electric cars into the electric grid. One reason electric cars have received public attention across the global north is that they have the potential to act as extensions to the grid, absorbing electrical energy whenever it's most available, say after midnight when demand is at its lowest. Yet Doris believed that regardless of how electricity is generated, electric vehicles could be an effective way to absorb excess electricity. During our conversation in that heavily air-conditioned cafe, Doris drew a diagram of transport electrification for me. As she drew, she pointed to the significance of electricity transmission operatives, such as the Electricity Company of Ghana, car importers, car assemblers and manufacturers such as Mana Mobility and Kantanka, as well as Porsche, researchers, charging infrastructure operators, and oil marketing companies such as Shell and Total, along with Ghana Oil. The diagram not only shows the entities that have entered relationships with the government, but also includes entities that remain ever present, such as the Aura Good Cat, which is given its own clearly demarcated box in the lower right-hand corner. Regardless of the back and forth between the government and the entities surrounding it, Chinese vehicles such as the Aura Good Cat continue to hover over them as a reminder of the dominance of technology producers. In March 2023, Doris and I visited the entrepreneur responsible for importing Great Wall Motors' Aura Good Cat to Ghana. A self-made man in his mid-50s who had grown up in a poor community in northern Ghana, Yusuf worked out of a 3-story strip mall in Accra's East Legon neighborhood, so the strip mall you see here. As Doris parked the Aura Good Cat that Yusuf had lent her for the week, his employees loaded dishwashers and washing machines into electric vans, preparing them for delivery to clients across the city. As an act of generosity toward his neighborhood, Yusuf mounted a massive TV on the glass facade of his establishment, which screened soccer matches from the streaming channel La Liga TV. Yusuf was a confident and charismatic business person who believed that he could change Ghana's future just as he had shifted the course of his own life. When Doris and I took seats in his private office, he started pitching ideas to us. What if we retrofit some trotro into electric vehicles, he suggested. It would decrease fuel costs for trotro drivers and generate more awareness regarding electric vehicles at the grassroots level. The most popular form of public transport in Ghana, trotro, is, as you see here, is privately owned minibuses that transport 10 to 20 passengers along fixed routes. Doris carefully took notes, impressed by his pragmatic and inventive perspective. Earlier that day, she had met with representatives from a European foundation who expressed an interest in potentially supporting transport electrification. She concurred that it might be an easy project. All they needed was some funding and some drivers willing to experiment. Yusuf had already put research and development plans in motion, collaborating with engineers from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology to design and complete the retrofit. Yusuf had earned a degree in business administration from an Australian university where he had spent some time working before moving to Accra with his Australian wife. Their company focused on importing appliances from China and distributing them throughout West Africa. Initially drawn to electric vehicles to reduce fuel and maintenance costs, Yusuf leveraged his existing networks to start importing vans and trucks for personal and professional needs. So you can see some of his fleet here. So this is one of the spots where he stores them. Despite acknowledging Great Wall's reliability as an automotive company, Yusuf diversified his range to include other motorcycles and cars, including Wuling electric vans and trucks, and other companies which now fill this parking lot here, and his maintenance facility. Yusuf was pleased that other successful entrepreneurs in the city were also venturing into importing electric vehicles. One of these was Fadi, a second-generation Porsche importer and dealer. In one conversation, Fadi had told me how the pandemic had disrupted supply chains and led to lengthy wait times for acquiring luxury electric vehicles. I had first met Fadi in late 2019 through a Turkish friend who was then employed by the Turkish energy company Aksa in Ghana. When I stopped by his car dealership in Accra's North Industrial Area in 2023, Fadi observed that even if the logistical challenges were resolved, the market for luxury electric vehicles in Ghana would not be large enough to sustain his business. In April 2022, he brought 2 Pickman mini trucks to Accra to assess their performance on the city's streets over a year. And so this is the car that you see here. In stark contrast to the Porsche, the Pickman truck, manufactured by Kayun Motors, a subsidiary of China's most significant architectural glass manufacturer, boasts a maximum speed of just under 30 miles per hour and prioritizes lightweight design, compact size, and affordability. The car's plastic components are of lower quality, and one of the trucks even lost an antenna during a test drive. But Fadi held firm in his belief that the trucks can withstand Accra's roads and saw a potential to sell 2,000 to 3,000 mini trucks monthly in Ghana. Like Yusuf, Fadi perceived this import agreement only as the beginning of his venture. As Doris and I prepared to leave his office, Yusuf shared his perspective on Ghana's development. Our aspirations for development are always geared towards emulating Europe, yet we constantly fall short. He proposed an alternative approach. Why don't we create our own model for transformation? He believed that embracing clean technology would enable Ghana to diverge from the dominant path of development espoused by the global north. If we fail to implement these systems, our grandchildren will be relegated to cleaning the glass walls of the line in Saudi Arabia, he observed, with reference to the real estate development project announced by Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in 2017, highlighting how a lack of investment in clean technology will only reinforce the dominance of global oil producers. If Ghana were to stay on the global north's energy transition timeline, its future population would remain on the losing end of this dominant trajectory. The entrepreneurs who helped realize the Drive Electric initiative subscribe to varying social and political agendas. Consider Simon, who invested in electric vehicle charging infrastructure in Accra. A soft-spoken African-American man in his mid-30s, Simon had decided to move to Accra from Maryland when his mother retired there in 2017. First, he opened a restaurant called Nuru, whose name means light in Swahili. Then he became interested in electric mobility and self-financed a charging infrastructure company called Ijanu, which means harness in Yoruba. One of his best friends in the US, who came from a Nigerian background, had suggested the name. Simon had played football as a college student and worked on Wall Street for a brief period before returning to Maryland to pursue US government contracts. Now, visitors to Ijanu's minimally furnished lobby, located near Fadi's car dealership in Accra's North Industrial Area, were welcomed with a quote from Kwame Nkrumah's "Africa must unite." For this end, Africa needs a new type of citizen, a dedicated, modest, honest, and informed man. A man submerges self in service to the nation and mankind. A man who abhors greed and detests vanity. A new type of man whose humility is his strength and whose integrity is his greatness. Surprised to see such signage in an office space, I imagined that Simon aspired to be the kind of man Nkrumah had envisioned. On the wall opposite the quote was a black and white image depicting portraits of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Patrice Lumumba, and Fred Hampton, all black activists and politicians who had been killed in the 1960s. Simon wanted his company's name to reflect his Pan-Africanist political ideals. However, the word Ijanu puzzled his Ghanaian colleagues, and led them to wonder whether the company had originated in Nigeria. Simon was not the only politically motivated entrepreneur I met in Accra. I encountered Carl by chance while waiting to meet Fadi at his car dealership. Mana means essence in Polynesian, he explained as he gave me his business card, which is why we gave the car company this name. It's also easy to pronounce. After a long career at BMW in Munich, Carl started a purpose-driven business. He continued to live in Munich, but traveled to Accra several times a year to collaborate with his growing team. By March 2022, Mana Mobility had completed a design sprint in collaboration with Ghana's Design and Technology Institute and was advertising plans to produce electric vehicles in the country starting in 2023. Overcapacity was now the country's most prominent topic, which meant that transport electrification mattered more to a broader array of constituencies. Carl hoped to collaborate with Fadi to establish an electric vehicle assembly plant in Ghana. Concentrating on two complementary processes for building electric vehicle infrastructure, Simon and Carl produced charging stations and hoped to start an assembly plant. Olaf focused on another area in seeking to implement the idea of battery swapping across Accra. When his Norwegian father started working with a cement company in Accra in the 1980s, Olaf had enrolled in an international school in the city. Working as a financial analyst for various energy companies in the UK in the 2010s, he had not imagined that his professional life would take him back to Accra. In January 2022, at the tail end of the pandemic, he self-financed a battery swapping startup called Kofa. The ideal customer for Olaf's company was a repair person using an electric motorcycle to travel to customers' homes. So this is the electric motorcycle you see here. Upon arrival, they would unplug the battery and use it to power their tools as they carried out their repairs. Inspired by successful battery swapping initiatives such as Taiwan's Gogoro, Kofa offered electric motorcycles and swapping stations. Olaf's political perspective on electric cars diverged from Simon's Pan-Africanist stance as he saw Kofa as a development initiative aimed at addressing urban problems. Even though Africa had the fastest urbanization rate globally, surpassing even China's, Olaf believed that the focus on rural development was disproportionate and that electric motorcycles and swapping stations might solve the last mile problem, supplying electrical power to urban contexts where the grid did not penetrate. Not necessarily because of physical barriers, but because of high electricity costs. In this context, Kofa would constitute a cheaper alternative than connecting to the grid, allowing consumers to avoid monthly subscription fees. Entrepreneurs such as Fadi, Yusuf, Carl, Simon, and Olaf formed alliances to create a space for electric vehicles in Ghana in response to electricity excess. Pushing back against the idea that the adoption of electric cars should follow the construction of a renewable energy-powered grid, they had supported Doris in her work at Drive Electric. Together, they sought to create a new development timeline. A deputy minister of energy from Ghana addressed the audience during a presentation at Houston's CERAWeek 2023 conference, the annual energy industry gathering, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Where are we that we have to transition, he said. We haven't even started. Electric vehicles need to come to Ghana. We can't be left behind and be dumped gas vehicles. Like him, other members of Ghana's electric vehicle sector saw the Drive Electric initiative as a way to prevent their country from becoming a dumping ground for gas-powered cars, a practice that's likely to increase in volume and speed as consumers in the global north switch to electric cars. How exactly do electric cars stop Ghana from becoming the dumping ground for second-hand gas-powered vehicles? A car that Doris test drove between August 2021 and January 2022, the Great Wall or a Black Cat, distinguished itself from this is not the right car, I'm sorry about the confusion of the image, but it's a different car, a smaller car. Priced between $8,000 and $10,000, the Chinese-made Black Cat was known for being one of the most affordable electric cars in the world. Writing for the clean technology website Clean Technica, Joseph Kuitzai, the founder of Electric Drive Africa, an organization that promotes electric vehicle use across Africa, labeled Ora Black Cat an ice killer, where ICE stood for internal combustion engine. He argued that cars such as the Ora Black Cat could land in Africa at prices comparable to used ICE vehicles that dominate imports into these markets and will be able to displace a good portion of used ICE vehicle imports and could help catalyze the transition. Such vehicles could significantly transform global flows. So how do ideas of linear progress become mobilized when building energy infrastructure, and how do emergent technologies repurpose such existing timelines? Drive Electric attempted to shift power production in the country by imagining that more renewable energy producers would be interested in building power stations if they knew that there was already a network of car batteries moving around. This understanding sought to reverse the order of energy transition in global north countries such as Denmark and Norway, where innovations in storage have followed the installation of renewable energy power stations. The proponents of Drive Electric pushed back against the assumption that Africa is not yet ready for electric vehicles, an implicit view in widely circulated reports, emphasizing that there is no single path to mitigating global emissions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I got so much out of them. They were so rich and informative. I think I was just wanting to bring in a thread into the discussion that also incorporates some of the images and media that are created by climate activists in kind of this space in relating to like new climate policy and how change happens. So I was interested in like how the planetary media as a kind of provocation, what it means to ground imaging and modeling of the environment in sort of more like material social relations. So for me, that also includes like activist bodies that physically occupy, block, at times sabotage, things like infrastructure that otherwise might remain quite abstract to us. So in this era of kind of impending climate collapse and climate anxiety that many people feel tangibly, there's this consequent rise in civil disobedience and violence and sabotage. And I've been interested for a while as civil disobedience is also very much a media practice now, quite a professional media practice. That, for me, is really all about raising the kind of image and the question of like the legality versus, or the illegality versus the morality of actions in an era of climate collapse. So I just wanted to think of a few examples. On the one hand, like in Tega's presentation, we've got this idea of the forced closure of a coal plant or the port that's kind of transporting the coal. And the kind of image that produces, it forces media coverage. It's very much meant to be controversial. It's not just meant to provoke a conversation, it's meant to really invoke intense public disagreement about what is acceptable versus legal. And then another kind of image that I think is important that circulated, maybe draws a bit more on the language of art history, but this image that circulated in the news a few years ago of two Just Stop Oil climate protesters that threw a can of tomato soup on a Van Gogh sunflower painting in the National Museum in London, and the way it became a meme, and then that took on a different kind of representation of this illegal behavior. And then I also just wanted to add that for me, these kind of images of planetary media are also today at the heart of climate climate trials. Whether it's outside the court or kind of inside the court, but how climate activist trials are a kind of media infrastructure where kind of testimony and certain kind of images get amplified or suppressed, and how courts are kind of like image-making spaces in this debate. So I was just interested in how planetary media is sort of asking us to maybe situate perspectives on technologies and modes of mediation, and the role of climate activists and their bodies and these images that are produced in shifting or defining or supporting kind of policy making and law changes and things like this. Thank you. Do you want to respond? Yeah. We might gather maybe some of the responses. Yeah, please hold on to you. Anthony.
I have the mic, so I guess I'll speak next. For me, there's been a question that I've been thinking about a lot about just enumeration generally. And I think thinking through how you all have each thought about, or you presented kind of an enumeration of complexity. You know, the thesis of our talks, by looking at Planetary, argues that there is some level of complexity that's going on that is bigger than kind of idiosyncratic practices. And I think all your talks pose maybe questions about how we think about complexity, either how individuals interface with geopolitical policies, trade policies vis-a-vis electric vehicles and its relationship to infrastructure, of how we try to think about planetary interactions or planet scale interactions through video games, right? That we literally have to put metrics down on the screen for someone to know if they're winning or losing or if they're doing better or worse. We distill down complexity to kind of very simple heuristics. The enumeration or trying to think about these planetary consequences through a very coarse measurement of the economy. How do we think about industrial sabotage and translate these aspects down to, I think you had articulated, to carbon particles, then to enumerate through dollars and cents, that act of translation. Or thinking about, I love the phrasing of the insufficiency of the image, that as an artifact of record, but that it itself is unable to reflect kind of the complexities of a fire. And then translating that to also how architecture as a way of thinking about territorial colonization as an artifact of seeing scale, but it itself is just an anecdote within a larger framework. So for me, maybe as a way of kind of actually bringing all these observations back to something, I wonder if we are to think about this action or policy, is it that these different ways act as maybe the, using the term sloths, like are these all the kind of small single things that we hope to chip away at these global paradigms of enumeration, quantification, and valorization in policy? Or do we really need to do a holistic kind of reframing towards this kind of, was it single large, right? Like, is the climate crisis, is social upheavals and conflicts so large that we really do need to have a wholesale rethinking, maybe on the scale of infrastructure versus maybe to go with that kind of analog and architectural or kind of these smaller, bespoke, individual, idiosyncratic actions that chip away from that. And for me, I struggle with that. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts as you also reflect on your own practices.
Maybe to pick up on some of those threads, I think I've also been responding today to that struggle of maybe binaries of scale. But I think, maybe just something that Alenda's talk activated within me was this idea of thinking about the social dimension, the sociality of mediation, and how all of our speakers are thinking about climate media as really contrary to what we might think. Media is not something as a kind of strictly receiver, like producer-receiver modality, but perhaps something that could activate participation, right, or considerations of a public. And to maybe borrow Alenda's term, which, because she started first, I think framed some things for me, but, if we go from idea of whole earth thinking, kind of like godlike structures of the hubris of man to, let's say, half to then partial, if we think about the term partial, maybe I'd invite us to think about partiality as owning the limitations of our humanity, in that that partiality is actually biased, right? That we have biases And within all the talks, I think there's an acceptance of limitation. And within that acceptance is about kind of maybe encountering the unscripted, right? Or allowing space for the unscripted response. And I see that in all the topics with Tega's work, in kind of like when she mentioned the failure of the solar protocols being human failures in a way, but I thought that was a very beautiful acknowledgement to also kind of DJ's kind of expressing surprise and delight at how nature responds in kind of new conditions that we might assign as good or bad. And then certainly also with Gökçe's work, like kind of the battery swapping and these kind of more ground up responses to transition that aren't about, let's say, wholesale protocols, but about kind of human networks.
Wow, that was really great. I'm totally stealing this idea of partiality as affection, like kind of, I think that's great. I was just going to respond to the first response, which is that I've actually thought a lot about climate activism as a very playful practice. And actually there's kind of like a weird paradox because a lot of it is premised on sort of the denial of childhood in the sense of like, this is pay attention because we're not able to be children because of you, essentially because of adults and the ways that they've behaved. But at the same time, a lot of what's happening, like throwing soup at the wall, right, at a painting, or like literally being like a toddler and just like lying on the ground and refusing to get up, or taping yourself or gluing yourself to a road. I think a lot of these practices strike me as like very playful, even though it's done in a serious, very earnest spirit, right? So I think I've been kind of wrestling with that, like that strange dichotomy between playfulness and also the denial of childhood. But also, it's like it's embodied in Greta Thunberg and, literally skipping school, school strike for climate, right? So I think that's really important. And then just briefly for Anthony, for the winning or losing, I think that's really great because Wilson, he actually says part of the reason he picked Half Earth was because he thought humanity needed a big goal. Like the psychology was that we need like a big goal to go after. It's like sexier than just like a small thing. And there's similar rhetoric over in like game studies, futurism with like Jane McGonigal, who makes a similar case that gamers are especially good at going for the quote unquote epic win, right? So it was really strange to see that mirrored in like the Wilson text.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yeah, you make a good point about the media dimension of climate activism. Obviously, like that is central to a lot of those actions. And in a project we actually did preceding that kind of led into Offset, we did a whole lot of interviews with activists, and basically we got given money from NYU to do a climate art project and was frustrated with the state of climate art, and so we did this elaborate thing where we formed an LLC and tried to figure out ways to just take NYU money and give it to activists because we didn't really know, we thought that would be the most effective move. And they let us do it, which is amazing. I'm still not quite sure why they let us do that, but we did it. But that was kind of the background to Offset. And in those interviews that we talked a lot to activists about their sort of negotiation with media and their strategies. And Max Kermey, who was involved in that Newcastle, Australia action, which was, not playful, like it was, extremely risky. They were all like suspended off cranes and storms coming over, and like it was, I think, very like difficult technically to pull that off. But they did shut it down for like 10 days, and a big part of that group's work was about like streaming on Facebook and streaming on Instagram the actions while they were happening. And I remember like being at work and then seeing live streams coming from like a crane above Newcastle Port. So really effective in terms of like building awareness of what are invisible infrastructures, you know, the fact that that's the biggest coal port in the world, like, and it's just down the road from where I grew up, and like I never really twigged that there was such a significant site of infrastructure down the road. So I think a very effective way of doing that. But then, of course, when they got arrested, part of the charges against them, and the most significant charge against them, was that they were inciting terrorism because of the live streams. So, you know, I think the legal apparatus is very aware of that media dimension and has done everything they can to like shut that down. And so it's really, I think, strangled that movement, sadly. Because, you know, there are all, and this came up over and over again, there are all just these old terrorism laws lying around after 9/11 that are just being repurposed to crack down on climate activism, which is, you know, devastating for, I think, the movement and for these young folks who are literally, yeah, they're just trying to get some kind of, you know, public support for change. You know, and I think part of this work has really led me to the conclusion that, yeah, like what you're saying, the legal system we have was built in the Holocene, and it's completely mismatched for the material conditions of the Anthropocene, and what do we do about that? And we did a lot of also interviews with lawyers to develop that offset project because we were kind of worried about it. Initially, it was supposed to be a platform where you could like post an action you wanted to do, and then people would pay you to do it, and the lawyers kept just saying, you can't fund crime. And we'd be like, is there a way around that? And they'd be like, no. And then I'd be like, the legal system's so conservative. And they'd be like, yes, that's literally the point, you know? And so as a non-lawyer, again, you know, I think as artists we occupy that sort of non-expert position where you're trying to surface what is so obvious, like it's not even worth talking about if you're in a discipline. But then if you're coming from outside, you're like, hey, that's weird. Like, why is the law like that? So anyway, yeah.
I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned about the kind of the coarseness of measurement that we have to deal with, the data that we have, the kind of maybe even also the bluntness and crudeness of the tools of media that we also are expected to use, and the disciplinary edges that we are bound to. But I think just the way that people respond to our media as a, you know, it either hits or it doesn't hit. And so there's already a baked-in coarseness to what we produce and to the material that we're analyzing and responding to. And I think that one of the interesting things that we've been encountering as we talk to scientists who are engaged in, you know, decades-long the experiments, like specifically the Mesocosm projects, which require so much mobilization of resources, money from various organizations and governments, and then the longue durée of detailed, precision-oriented, you know, they're counting the lizards in the grass every, you know, 20 times a day and maintaining all of the ecosystems and to understand at a very basic level at the output of the research a pretty crude number about like, oh, this many lizards died or whatever in response to this condition. And I think that the attitude that the scientists have, which is something that I think is almost impossible for me to wrap my head around about that kind of level of detail for the scale of the outcome of that data, is something that we need. I'm still processing how to respond, and I think playfulness might be one of the only ways to do it. But I think also one thing that you mentioned about you framed yourself as like an eccentric engineer, right? Was that right? The terminology. I love that moment in which the kind of eccentricity or the kind of off-axis positioning relative to a disciplinary edge begins to reframe the way that data might be transmitted in new ways. And I think that's what it feels like is our task at this point, right, in various ways.
Well, thank you for your comments and questions. And maybe I'll respond to the scale question as well, less in terms of like thinking about like how do you think about the global through the local, but more in thinking about how we build the conceptual vocabularies that allow us to think about scale. And as Emmeline mentioned in the beginning, I have a interest in ethnographic research methods and have been co-authoring a book called Patchwork Ethnography. And one of the things that we discovered while we were writing the book was to sort of imagine sort of like a way of asking questions and framing sort of issues that we're interested in as perhaps like our objects of observation. In this case, let's say I presented to you, a short piece about electric cars. We can imagine that electric car itself is an object of observation. What would be the adequate object of study to understand that object of observation? So that becomes a kind of a question that we ask ourselves as researchers and be able to develop the right kind of the framing to address the objects of observations themselves. And obviously, this is a kind of like a dynamic process where I gave you sort of like an answer to that question, thinking about sort of how temporality or imaginations of temporality might shape transformations in infrastructure. But again, this question is drawn both from experiencing these electric cars in motion, let's say, so there's a kind of like a cyclical, I guess, transformation that happens. Developing that framing for myself was really helpful, because then I can now think about sort of how do I understand the sort of the global implications, let's say, of the things that I see that might seem very small or insignificant, right? And so as anthropologists or ethnographers, we always ask these questions, but then always reach different kinds of conclusions. And so thinking about let's say, climate change or energy-related questions as well, one thing that I discovered, and I happened to sort of start doing research in Ghana completely by coincidence. This was not a plan that I had, but I became interested in the floating power plants that, again, Emmeline was mentioning, and the company gave me access to the plant that they had in Ghana, and so I became curious, so I thought, okay, I'll go and see what it's about. And then that turned into a sort of a 7-year-long research project in Ghana. And I became interested in sort of understanding how the electricity grid itself sort of comes together, and how electricity excess develops, and how people use the excess of. And I guess what's important about, and this is perhaps attending to the question of partiality as well. Are we impartial or partial? How do we think about again global questions? That all the theorizing that happens, let's say, about the sort of like big terms, like energy transition, happens in, let's say, the US or Europe, so in centers of sort of power. And when I first started doing research in Ghana, one of my interlocutors there was saying to me, we're transitioning in reverse here. So the transition that's happening here is like actually the opposite of what we're hearing about. But then as I started sort of investigating that question, I realized, no, actually there's no transition in reverse, because there's no transition. Actually, all energy sources, we've increased our use of all energy sources all around the world. And the infrastructure that's being used in Ghana now is the infrastructure that was being used in, like, let's say, India or Sri Lanka 10 years ago, and it just moves places. So the nation state is just a sort of a way of developing metrics that makes sense for the nation states that are developing them. But when you put them into global consideration, then actually those emissions are still being produced elsewhere. They're still they're having planetary effects, right? So that, I'm sharing that because I want to emphasize how we develop theoretical vocabularies. Those theoretical vocabularies are not necessarily being developed by looking at how the Ghanaian grid is being transformed, but rather perhaps with an aspiration towards sort of how let's say, the European grids might be transforming. So sort of switching that lens, I think, is also really helpful and refreshing in allowing us to see what the blind spots are in those dominant global discourses, and perhaps giving us a sort of like a more empirically also viable understanding of energy and climate change related dynamics. Yeah.
That's incredible, and I also know we're into the lunch hour, so I do want to invite our students, because I think this is like a porous discussion, and hopefully we'll continue into the lunch and then continue into the next session. But we have students in our midst and who are, really also the inheritors of these questions that we're wrestling with. So I want to not to turn it into like a really long thing, but I think if students here who have like thoughts about what you were seeing today and kind of processing these bigger questions, if you had maybe like a sentence or two, or how you are thinking about some of these concepts, from accumulation, scale, which we use often in architecture, we don't question enough, protocol, and also this question of the architectural imaginary and what we can still do as designers. So yeah, opening up to our amazing students here, and then also if there are like questions from folks, we can raise hands and do that kind of thing. But
yeah, I'm happy to get us started. Jumping to something, Tega, you said about the sort of like Earth automating our machines and versus the sort of machines operating the Earth, and then also something Gökçe, that you had mentioned about the vocabulary. I'm thinking about the sort of things that everyone has said today and the sort of circulation of affects happening where humans, and maybe more specifically infrastructures of capital and ecology and colonization, is training the world around us and sort of shifting naturalized systems, because these species, whether those are non-human or sort of landscapes, have gone through a series of adaptations. I'm thinking about maybe how we can stretch adaptation and the sort of the circulation of training the world around us into maybe how maybe media and images are training various publics to think through these crises, and if that's even happening, maybe how images are training us now, and maybe how humans are adapting through media, and if that even is happening, I don't know. So those are sort of my thoughts.
Thank you so much for each of your presentations. I think I have too many thoughts, but I'll condense them to just a couple of questions or even comments. One was speaking about media specifically. I wanted to talk about the biases that people may have for or against the media that you used, and also how you came to that decision. Like, I think, Catherine, you already spoke to it a little bit with Tega's project that she showed, how you actually leaned into it. There was an intention to have provocation with the medium that you chose to do in terms of a kind of satirical video or like a pastiche. And then I also wanted to think about that also specifically in terms of your project, Alenda, and the topic of games, because I think this is something, I have limited experience with games and world building, but in the few times where I have kind of engaged with it, I sat on reviews for the CDP program here, where people tend to kind of code games and software. And I felt like there were challenges in terms of gamifying serious issues, where sometimes it opens it up to criticism in terms of the whimsicality that is kind of embedded with games, but then addressing really serious and important issues. So I'm kind of curious about whether there were certain considerations that you had to keep in mind when it came to these kind of things. But yeah, I think that's
yeah, thank you so much. I think the thing I often find difficult in my own work is representing both the climate crisis and the scale of the planetary. I'm not even sure it's something that can be represented, but I was really excited by the kind of approach that each of you took in representing sort of a small chunk of this. So yeah, I'm interested in this role of representation. You mentioned the idea of a vocabulary, but like what forms of representation, language, image, decisions around color or texture, and how they can shape our approach to representing something that may in fact be not representable. And I think my second question too is where we see the role of feedback. I think we kind of incorporated feedback in different forms, from the scale of the test site to the call center. So yeah, I'm interested in this role of feedback and how we can, at multiple scales and from multiple parties, environmental, non-human, and how we can use that to continue to shape our approach to exploring the planetary.
Yeah, thank you guys all so much. All the talks were so interesting. Along the same lines, I think the word playfulness really stood out to me, and games are actually something I've been exploring this semester and also in past semesters. But I think playfulness, how I'm interpreting it right now, it's like two ways. First, like, I think our role as designers and architects and producers of media is to create something that invites people in, and I think that's synonymous with making something playful. And also speaking to what was said previously about the image being insufficient, I think playful also implies interactivity, and that's what's able to capture sort of the complexities and the need for dynamic states and variables, because I think the fault of the current stereotypical image is that it's static. So maybe this is more of a comment, but also my follow-up question is like, what is our duty right now as people who work in representation? What is maybe a very tangible way, actionable way that we can make things more playful?
Hello, thank you again for all of your presentations and also for just coming here and speaking with us all. My mind's kind of all over the place given, the variety of topics, although we are speaking about planetary medium. But I think I'm going to reiterate something that I think a few of us have already spoken about. I'm also deeply interested in this idea of engaging people through playfulness and, games as a form of media to introduce people to these topics. However, I am also struggling with this sense of like, where does whimsy stop us from actually engaging with the material? And Alenda, I like how you mentioned like this idea of keeping it, the issue with keeping it so global is that we tend to lose, sort of the micro scale, or we tend to become like a godlike figure in this play. So I think I'm just sort of interested in the transition of, taking in this media, introducing these topics, and then also getting people to, and my background sort of within like indigenous post-colonial studies, so sort of getting people to returning to the land and coming back to communities and sort of, handling issues within a grounded sense. So sort of the transition from media to the ground.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I've been thinking about the dichotomy between Donna Haraway's sort of God's eye view versus the more situated knowledge, and like the worm's eye view versus the bird's eye view, and so on. And then I forget who mentioned that this is also imposing a sort of binary on scale itself. And I'm curious about how we can think of the margins between the global and the local, the individual and the universal, and so on. And also I've been thinking in relation to the insufficiencies of the image, of the operational image, and the scholars that have spoken of this, and how the margins between these two scales are so often invisible. And in trying to render them visible through different modes of representation is ultimately a reduction and oftentimes even a romanticization of machine vision. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
I think we have also one student in that. If you want to, yeah. It's not to, don't worry, it's intractable for a reason, and I think as we compound and stew, these are obviously not questions we can all solve today, but they're incredible, I think, for us to sit with, because, this is not an expert panel of climate change. This is like a living room, as I said, and I think around the living room is where, we get to the heart of things, so, yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of more of a question or thoughts that are related to Dr. Chang's talk. But I completely agree that ludology and games are underrepresented in their ability for transscalar communication. I really love that you touched upon its ability, or the unique ability for it to exert agency and culpability on the player of the game. And I think that perhaps the challenge with video games is the scale of its influence, because it seems like a very deeply personalized experience. And I was wondering if you think that's an asset or a detriment to the medium itself. But I was also thinking about something that maybe wasn't touched upon is the social capability of video games, and thinking about, wondering if multiplayer, the role of social play, and what that has to what role does that play in planetary medium, or in expressing climatary concerns within video games, or even more broadly thinking about POVs and what role you are assuming within these games, and how we personally are consuming planetary media on a larger scale.
I'm also aware that we probably should really take it into lunch and kind of really lunch is in the next room 115, and this is where we have an opportunity to kind of simmer, steep, and just like ponder these really amazing conversations and questions. And like, thank you so much for the speakers for really just like jumping in and diving in, and like there's so many cross threads even in different disciplines and approaches, so it's really been a treat. And I maybe will open just for one kind of open question to the from the audience, if there is a lingering question you want to ask the panel. If I just wanted to make sure that there's space for one unscripted, like or unfree. Yeah, if there's any short, brief, burning question that anyone, no pun intended, might want to ask here. All right. Well, I think we can really thank our panelists, and let's have lunch together.